The wind that blew through Sagebrush Ford in the summer of 1878 had teeth. It was a noon-hour wind, hot and relentless, and it carried a fine, gritty dust that worked its way into everything: the folds of a man's shirt, the grain of a wooden storefront, the quiet corners of a lonely heart. It scoured the land, leaving the distant mountains looking raw and red under a bleached white sky. The creeks that spider-webbed across the territory had long since given up, their beds cracked and lined with a bitter white film of alkali. Time and weather had worn the world down to its bones. Eli Hart felt that scouring wind in his own soul. At 32, his face was already a map of hard miles and squinting suns. He stood by the splintered railing of his corral, one hand resting on the top post, calloused fingers tracing the deep grooves the years had carved into the wood. Before him, his entire fortune milled about in the dust, 18 head of bony cattle, 18 sad-eyed reminders of a dream that was drying up faster than the creeks. This place, Hart's Draw, was little more than a ramshackle cabin and a patch of thirsty land, but it was his. It was the only thing that was, and he was about to lose it. One last cattle drive, a desperate push north to the railhead at Cheyenne, was his only chance. If he failed, the bank in Laramie would swallow the Draw whole, and he'd be just another drifter, blown about by the same wind that was currently trying to peel the shingles from his roof. He left the corral and walked toward the town, his boots kicking up puffs of the pale dust. Sagebrush Ford wasn't much of a town, just a single street of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Wyoming Territory. The sign for Pike's General Mercantile creaked on its hinges, a lonely two-note song that never seemed to end. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and Agnes Pike's disapproval. She stood behind the counter, a woman as sturdy and unyielding as the mountains, her arms crossed over her apron. "You're a fool." "Eli Hart," she said, her voice raspy from the dust and a lifetime of speaking her mind. It was her usual greeting. "Afternoon." "Agnes," Eli replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Just need to settle up for the supplies." He knew he didn't have the coin. Not yet. This was just the first stop on his tour of promises. "You think a trail boss, a cook, and 3 hands is enough to move a herd to Cheyenne," she pressed, ignoring his gesture toward the ledger. "And one of those hands is barely old enough to shave." Tommy Birch, who had been examining a display of new spurs, flushed a deep red. At 19, Tommy had more eagerness than sense, but his loyalty was as solid as the anvil in Hector Ruiz's smithy. "I can ride with the best of 'em. Mrs. Pike," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. From the back of the store, where he was hefting a sack of flour onto his broad shoulder, Hector the blacksmith grunted. "The boy's got heart, and I can shoe a horse in a dust storm. We'll manage the work." Hector was a man of few words, but his presence was a comfort, solid and dependable. "It's not the work I'm worried about," Agnes said, her sharp gaze returning to Eli. "It's the food. You can't drive men for 2 months on hardtack and your own terrible coffee. You need a proper chuck wagon cook." Eli leaned against the counter, the weight of his problem settling back onto his shoulders. "I know it, and the good ones are already signed on with the big outfits. The rest are drunks who'll poison the whole crew." Agnes paused, tapping a finger on the worn countertop. "I heard a rumor," she began, lowering her voice slightly. "There's a cook over at the Galloway house in Dry Willow, an Irish woman, Maeve O'Rourke. They say she can make a feast out of salt pork and dried beans." Eli felt a flicker of hope. Dry Willow was a day's ride, but for a good cook, he'd ride 3. "What's the catch?" "The catch," Agnes said, her lips tightening, "is that they also say she's trouble. The kind of trouble that gets folks hurt. Got run out of a fancy hotel in Cheyenne for her temper. Word is she's quick with her tongue and even quicker with whatever's in her hand. A skillet, a bottle, a knife." Tommy's eyes went wide. Hector set the flour sack down with a soft thud. "A woman on a cattle drive. Hector said slowly, wiping a dusty hand on his leather apron. That's unusual. It's bad luck, is what it is, Tommy piped up, echoing the superstition of 100 campfires. It's only bad luck if she can't cook, Eli said, his mind already turning. He was a man drowning, and Maeve O'Rourke sounded like a log floating by. It might be rotten, it might have a snake on it, but he had to reach for it. He'd known his share of men who were praised for being tough and respected for their quick tempers. When a woman showed the same spine, she was called dangerous. The hypocrisy of it tasted as bitter as alkali dust. He had been on the wrong side of other people's judgment before. It had cost him his uniform and a piece of his soul. He wasn't about to do the same to someone he'd never even met. "I'm riding to Dry Willow," he announced, pushing himself off the counter. Agnes sighed. A long, weary sound. "You don't know what you're doing, Eli." "I know I'm out of options," he said. He gave her a nod, then one to Hector and Tommy, and walked back out into the glaring sun, the bell over the door giving a small, tinny chime behind him. Later that afternoon, the news of his plan had made its way down the street to the Larkspur, the town's only saloon. It was a dim, cool place that smelled of stale beer and regret. Eli nursed a whiskey, the cheap liquor doing little to calm the knot in his stomach. The talk buzzed around him like flies. Heard Hart's hiring a woman cook. The Irish one from Dry Willow, the one with the knife. He's desperate. That little patch of his is about to blow away. A woman on the trail. He's asking for trouble. Eli ignored them, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. He was used to being talked about, ever since he'd come back from his time with the cavalry. Not in a crisp blue uniform, but in dusty civilian clothes with a shadow in his eyes. He had been an object of speculation. They didn't know the whole story, the impossible choice he'd faced, the orders he couldn't follow. They just knew he was a man alone, scraping by on the edge of failure. Let them talk. Their words were just more wind. He didn't notice the man sitting by himself in the darkest corner of the room. The man was not a local. His clothes were of a better cut, though trail-worn, and the pistol holstered on his hip was a new model Colt, well-oiled and sitting easy. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, and he drank his whiskey slowly, methodically, his gaze never lifting from his glass. But he heard every word. He heard about Eli Hart's meager herd of 18 cattle. He heard about the desperate, last-ditch cattle drive. He heard about the route they planned to take, following the scarce water north. And he heard about the Spitfire cook from Dry Willow. The man's name was Vance Calder. He was a man who understood the value of information, a man whose business was cattle, though he rarely bothered with the trouble of raising them himself. The herds that moved north from the Powder River country often paid him a tax, a toll for safe passage, whether they knew it or not. A small, poorly manned drive like Hart's was hardly worth his notice. An easy meal, but small. But the mention of the water route, the plan to use the springs at Cottonwood Creek, caught his attention. He controlled that water, though no map said so. And a desperate man was a predictable man. Calder took a slow sip of his whiskey, the corners of his mouth turned up in a smile that never reached his eyes. This Eli Hart, this disgraced soldier, was about to have more trouble than an Irish cook with a temper. He had just made himself a player in a much larger game. Calder finished his drink, placed a coin on the table with a soft click, and slipped out the back door of the saloon, melting into the dust and the long shadows of the afternoon. He had plans to make. The ride to Dry Willow was a journey through a landscape that had forgotten the color green. Eli's horse kicked up a constant plume of pale dust that caked his throat and settled in a fine layer on his shoulders. Dry Willow itself was little more than a wider spot in the road than Sagebrush Ford, a collection of sun-baked buildings clinging to the banks of a creek that was more memory than water. The Galloway house was a 2-story clapboard structure with a sagging porch, looking tired and thirsty in the unrelenting sun. Eli found Maeve O'Rourke in the kitchen, a room that felt hotter and more chaotic than the forge at Hector's smithy. She was a whirlwind of motion in the center of it all. Her hair was the color of a sunset, a riot of red strands escaping a hastily tied knot at the nape of her neck. A constellation of freckles was splashed across her nose and cheeks, and her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, held a look that Eli recognized instantly. It was the look of a person who had been pushed to their limit and had decided they would not be pushed an inch farther. It was a look he often saw in the mirror. She was stirring a large pot with one hand and slicing onions with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, onions, and steam. A large, beefy man in a dusty trail coat, a customer by the looks of him, sidled up beside her, leaning in too close. "Smells good, darlin'," he said, his voice greasy with familiarity. "Almost as good as you." His hand moved toward her waist, without looking up from her onions, without missing a single beat in her stirring. Maeve shifted her weight. The heavy cast-iron skillet she was using moved in a short, sharp arc, the handle connecting solidly with the man's encroaching hand. It wasn't a violent swing, just a firm, undeniable block. A redirection. The man yelped and snatched his hand back, cradling his stinging fingers. "Hey!" he sputtered, his face a mixture of surprise and anger. Maeve finally looked at him, her expression utterly calm. "The food is for paying customers," she said, her voice low and even, with a lilt that spoke of a home far across the ocean. "I am not on the menu." She turned back to her work, dismissing him as completely as if he had evaporated. The man, after a moment of glowering at the back of her head, shuffled away, muttering under his breath. Eli had watched the entire exchange from the doorway, unnoticed. He'd seen bar fights that started with less. He'd seen men draw guns over a misplaced glance. But this was different. It was efficient. It was a boundary drawn and defended without a single wasted motion. He stepped into the kitchen. "Miss O'Rourke." She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes sized him up in a single, sweeping glance, taking in his worn boots, his patched shirt, his steady gaze. "I am," she said. "If you're here to complain about the stew." The line forms behind the man with the sore hand. "No, ma'am." Eli said, "I'm here to offer you a job." He laid it out for her, the words spare and direct, just like the landscape outside. A 2-month cattle drive to Cheyenne, 18 head of cattle, a small crew. He needed a cook. He told her what he could pay $45 a month, plus rations. It was a generous offer, more than he could really afford, but he knew her worth after watching her for less than a minute. She listened without interruption, her gaze unwavering. When he was finished, she was silent for a long moment, studying his face. "Small crew," she said finally. "Desperate owner, long odds. Why should I trade this hot box for a hotter one on wheels?" "Because out there, the only trouble you'll have to deal with is the kind that comes from the land and the sky," Eli said. "Not the two-legged kind that can't keep their hands to themselves. On my drive, you'll have your own space. You'll be treated with respect. That's a guarantee." She considered this. "There are conditions," she said. "I'm listening. The pay is fair. The rations are mine to control. I bring my own tools." She patted a bone-handled knife at her belt. "And my own protection." Her hand drifted to a small bulge in her apron pocket that Eli suspected was a Derringer pistol. "I'll have my own bedroll, and I'll place it where I see fit, separate, and the most important rule," she said, her moss-green eyes locking onto his, "is that if any man in your employ lays a hand on me in a way I don't welcome, you fire him on the spot. No questions, no excuses. If you don't, I walk, and I take the skillet with me. Are we clear?" "As a mountain stream," Eli said without hesitation. It was more than fair. It was the way things ought to be, even if they rarely were. When can you start? 2 days later, Maeve O'Rourke arrived at Hart's Draw on the morning stagecoach, carrying a single carpet bag and a look of grim determination. Eli's camp kitchen was a sorry sight, a blackened fire pit, a rickety table made from warped planks, and a few dented pots hanging from a rope strung between 2 posts. Maeve surveyed the setup with a critical eye, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't complain. She just dropped her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. In the space of an afternoon, she transformed the pathetic camp. She had Hector Ruiz, with his quiet strength, help her dig a proper fire trench and line it with flat stones to hold the heat. She had him build a sturdy windscreen from scrap lumber to keep the incessant wind from stealing the flames. She directed Tommy Birch to rig a heavy canvas tarp overhead, angled just so to provide shade and keep the worst of the alkali dust from settling in the food. She unpacked her own well-cared-for spice tins, a small sourdough starter crock, and a set of sharp knives that she honed herself. The dilapidated camp kitchen was reborn as a functional, orderly chuck station. It had a purpose. It had a heart. The rest of the crew assembled that evening. There was Hector and young Tommy, both already viewing Maeve with a kind of awed respect. Then came the others. Lou Tate was a wiry, sun-scorched cowboy with a sour disposition and eyes that seemed to be permanently narrowed against the glare. He slouched against the corral fence, chewing on a piece of straw, his disapproval a palpable thing. Jeb Crow was his opposite, a tall, lean black man with a calm, watchful demeanor. He moved with an easy grace, and the rifle he carried looked like an extension of his own arm. He gave Maeve a polite, assessing nod. The last to arrive was a surprise to everyone but Eli. Nell Carter rode in on a sturdy mare, a woman in her late 20s with a kind face and capable hands, a widow with a young son back in town. She was known as one of the best horsewomen in the county. "This is Nell," Eli announced. "She'll be helping Maeve with the supplies and giving us an extra hand where needed." A few of the men, Lou in particular, looked surprised. 2 women on one drive. That night, as the smell of simmering beef and onions filled the air for the first time at Hart's Draw, the tension was thick enough to cut with one of Maeve's knives. The crew sat around the fire, eating from tin plates. The stew was rich and flavorful, better than anything they'd had in months. Even the coffee, brewed dark and strong in a big enamel pot, seemed to chase away some of the weariness from their bones. It was the taste of survival, hot and bitter and welcome. Lou Tate broke the silence, swilling the last of his coffee. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked pointedly at Maeve. "Never thought I'd see the day," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "An outfit with a kitchen run like a sewing circle. A woman's place is in the home, not on the trail." Maeve didn't flinch. She continued to scrub a pot, her back to him. "A man's place is to do the job he's paid for, Mr. Tate," she said without turning around. "Not to flap his gums like a loose shutter in a high wind. If you'd rather cook your own meals, be my guest." Lou's face darkened. He started to get to his feet, but Eli's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold as a winter morning. "Sit down, Lou." Eli didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Let's be clear on the rules of this outfit," he said, his eyes moving over each man. "My word is law. What I say, goes. And I say Miss O'Rourke is the boss of this fire and everything around it. Her word in the kitchen is the same as mine on the trail. You will show her, and Mrs. Carter, the same respect you show me. If you have a problem with that, you can collect your pay and ride out now. There's the road." He let the silence hang in the air. Lou Tate stared at him, his jaw tight, but eventually he sank back down, picking up his empty plate and pointedly avoiding everyone's gaze. The challenge had been met, the line drawn. From that moment on, the camp settled into a routine. There was a grudging respect, if not warmth, The men learned that Maeve was tireless, organized, and a magician with salt pork and beans. They learned that Nell was a hard worker who could ride and rope as well as any of them. But the rumors that had followed Maeve from Dry Willow still clung to her like trail dust. The story of her departure from the hotel in Cheyenne had grown with each telling. In some versions, she had merely argued with the manager. In others, she had attacked him in a blind rage. Vance Calder, sitting in a saloon 100 miles away, had made it his business to learn the truth of the matter. He'd paid a man who knew a man who had worked at that hotel. The story he got back was simple and ugly. The manager had cornered Maeve in the pantry, his intentions clear. She had warned him off. He hadn't listened. So she had picked up a full bottle of whiskey and brought it down on his head with enough force to shatter the glass. She hadn't been fired so much as she had quit, walking out the front door before the unconscious manager had even been discovered. To the timid citizens of the territory, this made her a dangerous, unpredictable woman. To Vance Calder, it made her something else entirely. It made her interesting. It meant that Eli Hart's small, desperate cattle drive now included a volatile element. A woman who didn't just carry a knife but knew precisely how and when to use it. A woman who would fight. Calder smiled to himself. He enjoyed a game with unpredictable pieces. It made the winning all the more satisfying. The herd moved north at the pace of a slow river, a dusty, brown current flowing across the immense, sun-scorched canvas of the plains. For a week, they had pushed the cattle through a world of muted colors, the rhythm of the days marked by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. The waterholes were farther apart than Eli remembered, and the grazing was thin. Each morning, he and one of the hands would ride out ahead, scouting for the next patch of drinkable water, a life-giving necessity that dictated their every move. On the 8th day, it was Maeve's turn to ride with him. It wasn't a formal rotation, but an unspoken understanding had developed. She had a keen eye for the lay of the land, for the subtle dips in the terrain or the thin lines of cottonwoods that might signal a hidden spring. She rode with a straight-backed competence that belied Lou Tate's grumbling, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space built on the mutual respect of hard work. By midday, the air had grown thick and heavy, the sky taking on a bruised, yellowish hue. The usual wind died down, leaving a stillness that was more menacing than the constant, scouring gusts. Eli pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes on the towering clouds massing in the west. They were the color of a dark slate, their bellies churning. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice flat. "A bad one." Maeve nodded, her own gaze fixed on the unnatural sky. "I can feel it in the air. It's gone heavy." They were miles from the main camp, exposed on the vast, treeless prairie. The first sign of the storm's true nature was not rain, but a sudden, violent drop in temperature. A cold wind whipped across the plains, carrying the scent of ice and wet earth. Then came the sound, a low, distant roar that grew steadily louder, like a freight train bearing down on them. "Hail," Eli bit out, his eyes scanning the empty landscape for any sign of shelter. "We need to find cover now." He saw it then, a small, dark shape on the horizon that he'd almost missed, a tiny imperfection in the endless line where earth met sky. A line shack, one of the small, crude shelters built by the big cattle outfits for their riders, likely abandoned for years. "There," he yelled over the rising roar. "Pointing, ride." They spurred their horses into a gallop, the animals' ears flat against their heads, sensing the impending violence of the storm. The first hailstone struck just as they reached the shack. They were the size of marbles, hitting the dry ground with sharp cracks. Eli leapt from his saddle, throwing open the creaking plank door and pulling his horse inside the small, dark space. Maeve was right behind him, her own mount skittering nervously. They had just managed to pull the door shut when the full fury of the storm broke. The sound was apocalyptic. The hailstones, now the size of pigeons' eggs, hammered against the shack's tin roof, creating a deafening, metallic din that made conversation impossible. It sounded as if 1,000 blacksmiths were trying to beat the roof flat. The tiny structure shook with the assault. Through the single dirty pane of glass in the wall, they could see the world outside dissolving into a white, churning chaos. The ground was already covered in a layer of bouncing ice. Any animal, any person, caught in that would be beaten to death. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of dust, dry rot, and old mouse nests. It was a single small room, barely large enough for the two of them and the nervous horses. As his eyes adjusted, Eli saw a rusted pot-bellied stove in one corner and a crude bunk against the far wall. He moved to the horses, speaking to them in a low, calming voice, running a hand down their trembling flanks. Maeve stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the terrifying spectacle. The bombardment lasted for what felt like an hour. The relentless, punishing rhythm of the ice on the roof was a physical force, pressing in on them. When it finally began to subside, the deafening roar softening to a loud drumming, the silence that followed felt vast and fragile. "Are you all right?" Eli asked, his voice sounding strange and loud in the sudden quiet. Maeve turned from the window. "I am," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I've never seen anything like it." The temperature in the shack had plummeted. Eli found a few pieces of dry, forgotten wood behind the stove and, using his flint and steel, managed to coax a small, sputtering flame to life. The fire was meager, but its warmth and flickering orange light pushed back against the cold gloom, creating a small island of comfort in the battered world. They stood near the stove, extending their hands to the growing warmth. The hail had softened to a hard, driving rain. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls and highlighted the lines of weariness on Eli's face. He stared into the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He looked older in that moment, burdened by something far heavier than a failing ranch. "You've seen worse storms than this, I'd wager," Maeve said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli didn't look at her. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The ones men make are always worse." The words hung in the small space between them. Maeve didn't press. She simply waited. A patient, unobtrusive presence. He had offered her a place of respect and safety. She now offered him a moment of quiet witness. "I was a cavalry scout," he began, the words coming out slowly, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, cold well. "Signed on for the adventure, I suppose. Thought I was serving a purpose." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "We were under a commander, a man who saw glory in destruction. We tracked a band of Cheyenne for weeks. He claimed they'd raided a settlement. Though the evidence was thin, we found their winter camp. It wasn't a war party. It was a village. Women, children, old men, families." He fell silent. The crackle of the fire, the only sound. Maeve could see the scene reflected in his eyes, the firelight glinting off the memory of another, more terrible fire. The order came down at dawn. Eli continued, his voice now a low monotone. "Annihilation. That was the word he used. Leave no one standing. I couldn't do it. My lieutenant and I, a few others. We refused the order. There was a standoff, right there in the snow, with our own men. We managed to create enough confusion that some of them got away. Women and children who ran into the hills. Not enough of them. Not nearly enough." He finally looked away from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a profound and ancient pain. "I was court-martialed. Insubordination in the face of the enemy. They wanted to hang me. My lieutenant. His family was influential, and he and the others spoke for me. Said I was a good soldier. Just misguided by conscience. They settled for a dishonorable discharge. I was lucky. They said," he shook his head slowly, "I've never felt lucky. I see their faces sometimes, when I close my eyes. The ones who didn't make it. I should have done more. I should have stopped him, not just disobeyed. He had given her the heaviest part of himself, the secret that had carved the lines on his face and put the shadow in his eyes. He was not just a failed rancher. He was a disgraced soldier who had chosen his own conscience over orders and had been living with the bloody cost ever since. Maeve listened, her expression unreadable but for the deep sympathy in her eyes. When he was finished, she simply nodded. She didn't offer empty words of comfort or absolution. She offered him something better understanding. "I was raised in Boston," she said, her own voice soft, turning her gaze to the fire, "in a part of the city where being Irish was like being born with a stain on your soul. We were crowded into tenements, taking the jobs no one else wanted. There were rules, you see, unspoken ones. Don't look a man of property in the eye. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. Be grateful for the scraps you're given." She picked up a small twig from the floor and pushed it into the edge of the fire, watching it blacken and curl. I was never very good at following those rules. I learned early that if I didn't stand up for myself, I'd be trod underfoot. If a man in the street spoke to me with disrespect, I learned to answer him with a tongue sharp enough to make him bleed. If a boss tried to cheat me of my wages, or worse, I learned that a well-aimed boot or a heavy object was more persuasive than tears. She looked at Eli. "They call me feisty, difficult, dangerous. I've been called those things my whole life. But I was just trying to survive. I came out here to the West because I heard it was a place where a person was judged by what they could do, not who their father was or what ship they came off of. I came out here so I could finally breathe without feeling like someone's boot was on my chest." They stood in silence for a long time after that, the two of them. Two outsiders who had refused to break under the weight of the world's expectations. He, the soldier who had defied a brutal command. She, the woman who had defied a world that tried to keep her small. The storm outside had passed, and a pale, watery sunlight was beginning to filter through the clouds. The only sound was the drip of water from the eaves and the gentle hiss of the dying fire. In that quiet, battered shack, a fragile understanding was forged, a bond of mutual respect between two people who knew the cost of drawing a line and refusing to let anyone cross it. The ride back to camp was slow. The prairie was transformed, washed clean and studded with glittering jewels of ice that were already beginning to melt under the returning sun. They found the camp in a state of disarray. The men struggling to calm the spooked cattle and right the chuck wagon, which had been battered by the hail. But it was something else that drew Eli's attention. A set of hoof prints in the damp earth near the edge of the camp. They were fresh, not from any of their horses. "Jeb," Eli called out, his voice sharp with a new tension. "Did we have visitors?" Jeb Crow walked over, his face grim. "No one came into camp, but we found this." He led Eli and Maeve over to a small group of cattle huddled by the corral. One of the cows was bleeding from its ear. A piece of it was missing, cut away in a distinct, jagged V shape. Eli felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had seen that mark before. Every rancher in the Powder River country knew it. It was not a brand, but a claim, a threat. "Calder's mark," Hector Ruiz said, his voice a low rumble. "That's Vance Calder's sign." Calder's mark was a promise of violence, and it was a promise Vance Calder was known to keep. The mood in the camp shifted, the easy rhythm of the trail replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. Eli moved the herd forward with a grim urgency, pushing them harder, knowing that to stop was to become an even easier target. Their path north led them directly to Cottonwood Creek, the only reliable water source for 50 miles, and crossing it required them to use the old, rickety wooden bridge that spanned the deepest part of the channel. It was a natural choke point. It was the perfect place for an ambush. They saw them from a mile out. A line of riders silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky, waiting for them on the far side of the bridge. There were at least a dozen men, maybe more, their casual postures doing nothing to hide the rifles resting across their saddles. As they drew closer, Eli recognized the man at their center. Vance Calder sat on a fine black stallion, a confident, proprietary air about him, as if he owned the very land they stood on. Eli halted the herd 100 yards from the bridge, signaling for his crew to hold their positions. He rode forward alone, his hands in plain sight, resting on the pommel of his saddle. Calder met him in the middle of the bridge, the timbers groaning under their horses' weight. "Hart," Calder said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a chilling contrast to the menace in his eyes. "Fancy meeting you out here. That's a mighty small herd you've got. Hardly worth the trouble of the trail, I'd think." "It's worth it to me," Eli replied, his own voice low and steady. "We're just passing through. Calder, we don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Calder gave a theatrical sigh. "Nobody ever wants trouble, but things have a cost out here. This water," he said, gesturing with his gloved hand to the creek flowing below, "is under my protection, and for that protection, I require a fee, a toll, if you will. Say $2 a head." Eli's jaw tightened. $36. It was more cash than he had in the world. It was theft, plain and simple. This is open range, and that's a public crossing. You have no right. "Right," Calder chuckled. A dry, humorless sound. "I have a dozen rifles that say I have all the right I need. Pay the toll. Hart, and you can water your cattle and be on your way. Refuse, and you may find this country to be very inhospitable." As if on cue, a second group of riders appeared, approaching from the south. This group was led by a man with a tin star glinting on his vest. Sheriff Doyle Briggs of Sagebrush Ford reined in his horse, a look of mild concern on his fleshy face. "Well now, what seems to be the trouble here? Gentlemen," he asked, his tone suggesting he'd just happened upon a friendly disagreement. Eli felt a cold spike of despair. Briggs was the law, but the way he avoided Calder's eyes, the way his men fanned out to effectively block any retreat, told Eli everything he needed to know. The law was not here to help him. The law was here to witness the robbery. "Just a business transaction, Sheriff," Calder said smoothly. "Mr. Hart was just about to pay me for access to my water." "Now, Eli," Briggs said, turning to him with a frown of feigned impartiality. "You know, Mr. Calder has interests in this area. It's best to be neighborly. Pay the man and avoid any unpleasantness." The bridge beneath him felt like a precipice. On one side was ruinous submission. On the other was open defiance. He looked past Calder, past the smirking faces of his hired guns, past the corrupt sheriff, and saw his small crew waiting. He saw Tommy Birch, his young face pale but resolute. He saw Hector, his big hands resting near the pistol at his belt. He saw Jeb's calm watchfulness, and he thought of Maeve and Nell, back with the wagon. He thought of the promise he'd made to Maeve, to keep the trouble to the kind that came from the land and the sky. He had failed. "We're not paying you a damn cent." "Calder," Eli said, his voice ringing with a finality that surprised even himself. "This is a free country. We'll water our stock, and then we'll be on our way." Calder's smile vanished. A poor choice. Hart, a very poor choice. He turned his horse and rode back to his men. "You heard him, Sheriff. He's refusing to be reasonable." Sheriff Briggs sighed dramatically. "Well, I can't force a man to be sensible. I've done my duty." With that, he and his men turned and rode off, leaving Eli's small outfit to face Calder's gang alone. For a long, tense moment, the two groups faced each other across the bridge. Eli expected a charge, a hail of gunfire, but Calder just smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. He raised a hand, and his men slowly, deliberately, turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over a low rise. The threat was not withdrawn, merely postponed. They crossed the bridge and watered the herd in a tense, hurried silence. Eli knew Calder was toying with them. He was a cat, and they were the mouse. The attack wouldn't come in the daylight, not when they were watchful and ready. It would come in the dark. They made camp a few miles past the creek, choosing a defensive position in a shallow, defensible basin. There would be no sleep that night. Eli posted double guards, with Hector and Jeb taking the first watch. Maeve, sensing the futility of preparing a proper meal, simply kept a large pot of coffee brewing over a low fire, its bitter aroma a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. The mood was grim. The men checked and rechecked their weapons, their face tight with apprehension. The attack came hours later, long after the moon had set. It began not with a gunshot, but with a sudden, panicked lowing from the herd. Then came the sound of galloping horses, and the first muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from three sides at once. It was a coordinated assault, designed to create maximum chaos. Bullets ripped through the canvas of the chuck wagon and thudded into the hard-packed earth. The herd Eli yelled over the din. "They're trying to stampede them. Hold your positions." But it was too late. A flaming torch arced through the air and landed squarely in the back of the chuck wagon, where the oilcloths and dry goods were stored. The wagon went up in a whoosh of flames, the fire blossoming into a terrifying orange flower that turned the campsite into a flickering, hellish stage. The cattle, already spooked, broke into a full-blown stampede, a thundering wave of terrified animals crashing through the camp. In the fiery, chaotic light, Eli saw Tommy Birch, his young face a mask of determination, running not for cover, but toward the fleeing cattle, trying to turn the leaders, to stop the panic. It was a brave act. It was a foolish act. A single gunshot cracked from the darkness, and Tommy stumbled, a look of profound surprise on his face. He fell and was lost in the dust and the thundering hooves. The world seemed to slow down for Eli. The roar of the fire, the crack of rifles, the thunder of the stampede, it all faded to a dull hum. He saw Maeve and Nell struggling with a fallen tent near the burning wagon. As the wagon shifted, its axle broken, a heavy wheel began to topple directly toward Nell. Without a thought, Maeve threw herself forward, shoving Nell clear just as the wheel crashed down where she had been. Maeve cried out in pain as the heavy axle grazed her, sending her sprawling. The sight of Maeve on the ground, the image of Tommy falling, broke through Eli's shock and forged it into a cold, lethal rage. This was the same kind of senseless violence he had refused to participate in all those years ago. But this was not an order to be defied. This was an assault to be met. "Jeb Hector." "On me," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. They laid down a volley of covering fire, their shots more measured, more aimed, than the wild firing from Calder's men. They were no longer just defending, they were fighting back. The firefight was short and brutal, faced with a small but determined defense, and with their primary goal of scattering the herd accomplished. Calder's men melted back into the darkness. The silence that descended was more profound, more terrible than the noise it replaced. It was a silence filled with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, the crackle of the dying fire from the chuck wagon, and the soft, whimpering moans of the wounded. The heart of their small enterprise was a smoking, blackened ruin. The chuck wagon, Maeve's domain, was gone. Their food, their supplies, their tools, all of it was ash and twisted metal. Half the herd was gone, scattered to the four winds. Nell had a long, ugly gash on her leg from a splintered plank. Maeve was clutching her shoulder, her face pale with pain in the flickering firelight. And Tommy Birch was dead. They found him after the last of the stampeding cattle had passed, his body broken and still. Lou Tate, the cynical, sour-faced cowboy, was the one who knelt beside him, his face a crumpled, unrecognizable mask of grief. He gently closed the boy's unseeing eyes. The spirit of the crew, the fragile hope that had carried them this far, was shattered. They were beaten. They had lost everything: their supplies, their cattle, their friend. They were a small, broken band of survivors, stranded in a hostile land with a dead boy and no future. As the first bleak light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they heard the sound of approaching wagons. Eli and Jeb grabbed their rifles, expecting Calder to return and finish the job. But the figures that emerged from the morning mist were not hired guns. It was a small procession from Sagebrush Ford. Agnes Pike sat grimly on the seat of the lead wagon, holding the reins herself. Beside her were two farmers Eli recognized, their face set and hard. In the wagon behind them were more townsfolk, armed with old hunting rifles and a quiet determination. Agnes pulled her wagon to a halt at the edge of the devastated camp. Her sharp eyes took in the smoldering ruins of the wagon, the scattered supplies, the exhausted, defeated faces of the crew. Her gaze finally rested on the still form of Tommy Birch, lying under a blanket. Her face, usually a mask of stern disapproval, softened with a deep and profound sorrow. "We heard a rumor," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "A freighter came through town last night. Said he heard some of Calder's men bragging in a saloon. Said Calder was planning to wipe you out. Take everything you had. We came as fast as we could." She looked around at the destruction, at the body of the boy who had just days ago been admiring spurs in her store. "Looks like we were too late to stop him." She climbed down from the wagon, her movements stiff. She walked over to Eli, her eyes meeting his. "What he's done here," she said, her voice low but ringing with a core of steel. "What he did to that boy. This isn't just your fight anymore. Eli, he's declared war on all of us." The retreat from the ruins of their camp was a silent, somber procession. They buried Tommy Birch on a low hill overlooking the creek, wrapping him in a spare blanket from Agnes Pike's wagon. Hector Ruiz hammered a simple cross from 2 pieces of charred wood, and Lou Tate, his face carved with a grief that had aged him 10 years overnight, placed the boy's worn hat upon the grave. No one said much. The vast, indifferent sky seemed to swallow any words they might have had. They made their way not back to Sagebrush Ford, but to a secluded homestead a few miles outside of it, owned by the widow, Maribel Sloan. She was a woman who had seen her own share of hardship and who asked no questions, offering them the use of her large, sturdy granary as a refuge. It was a place of shadows and the ghosts of harvests past, the air thick with the sweet, dusty smell of old grain. It was there, in the dim, lantern-lit space, that they began to piece themselves back together. It was Maeve who lit the first new fire, while the men tended to the wounded and tried to account for the few cattle they had managed to round up. She became a quiet force of order in the chaos, with Nell Carter, her arm now bandaged, at her side. She took stock of the meager provisions donated by the townsfolk. A sack of flour here, a side of bacon there, some coffee, some beans. It wasn't much. From the blackened skeleton of her chuck wagon, she had salvaged a single cast-iron pot and a bent skillet. It was enough. She set up a makeshift kitchen against the sheltered wall of the granary. She found wild onions growing along a nearby ditch and sturdy greens she recognized from her travels. She sent Hector out to hunt, and he returned with 2 lean prairie grouse. Soon, the smell of roasting meat and simmering broth began to push back against the lingering scent of ash and despair. She worked with a silent, focused intensity, her movements economical and precise. She was not just cooking food. She was restoring a small piece of the world, creating a circle of warmth and sustenance in the heart of their ruin. She was reminding them, without saying a word, that they were still alive, and that the living had to eat. That night, the small group of survivors and the handful of armed citizens from Sagebrush Ford gathered in the town's small, unadorned chapel. The pews were hard, the air was cool, and the only light came from a few coal oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. They were not there to pray, but to make a decision. Agnes Pike stood before them, her face a stern mask in the flickering light. "Vance Calder has been a blight on this territory for years," she began, her voice low and hard. "We've all paid his prices. We've all looked the other way. He strong-arms the miners coming out of the hills for a piece of their dust. He threatens the girls down at the saloon for a share of their wages. He's squeezed every small rancher in this valley, forcing them to sell their stock to him for pennies on the dollar or risk finding their wells fouled and their fences cut." She paused, her sharp gaze sweeping over the faces in the pews. What he did to Eli's outfit, to that boy, that was different. That wasn't just greed, that was a message. It was a message to all of us that he is the law, that he can take what he wants, and no one can stop him. Sheriff Briggs is in his pocket, and the nearest federal marshal is 200 miles away. No one is coming to help us. We are on our own. A heavy silence filled the chapel. The weight of her words settled on them. The undeniable truth of their isolation. They were a handful of ordinary people, a blacksmith, a shopkeeper, a few farmers, a disgraced soldier facing a man with a private army and the law on his payroll. Eli sat in the back pew, listening. Every word Agnes spoke was another stone on his conscience. He had led them to this. His desperation, his pride, his refusal to bend to Calder's will had brought this firestorm down upon them all. He had gotten a boy killed. He had put Maeve, Nell, all of them in the path of a monster. Just then, the chapel door creaked open, and one of the farmers slipped inside, his wife behind him. She was holding the hand of their small son, a boy no older than 6, whose face was streaked with tears. "It's Calder's men," the farmer whispered, his voice tight with fury. "They rode through town, drunk and loud. This one," he nodded at his son, "was playing in the street, and one of them nearly ran him down. When I yelled at him, he just laughed and shoved the boy. Said the whole damn town would learn to show respect." The boy had a long, raw scrape on his forearm where he had fallen. Eli watched as the boy's mother tried to comfort him, her own hands trembling. Something inside Eli, a wall he had spent years building around the painful memories of his past, finally cracked. He saw not the farmer's boy, but the terrified faces of the Cheyenne children running into the snow. He saw Tommy Birch, his face a mask of surprise as he fell. The fear of it, the suffocating, paralyzing fear of being responsible for the suffering of innocent people, washed over him in a cold wave. He stood up abruptly and left the chapel, unable to breathe in the suddenly too small space. He walked back toward the granary, a hollow ache in his chest. He was a fool, a damn fool who had mistaken stubbornness for courage. He had led them into a fight they couldn't win, and now more people were going to get hurt. He was standing in the shadows, staring at the silhouette of the mountains against the starry sky, when Maeve found him. She didn't say anything at first, just came and stood beside him, a quiet presence in the darkness. The scent of wood smoke clung to her clothes. "They're going to fight," he said, his voice rough. "They're talking about setting a trap for him. They're all going to get themselves killed. Because of me. They're fighting for their own reasons." "Eli," she said softly, "this fire was lit long before you came along. You were just the spark that fell in the kindling." "It's not enough," he said, turning to face her, the torment clear in his eyes. I can't lose anyone else. I can't be the reason." His voice broke on the last word. This was the soldier who had faced a court-martial, the man who had stared down Vance Calder on a bridge, and he was coming apart. He was afraid. Maeve looked up at him, her face pale in the starlight. She saw the raw guilt and fear he was carrying, and it terrified her, not for what he might do, but for what might be done to him. She saw him placing himself between Calder and everyone else, preparing to sacrifice himself, and she realized with a sickening lurch that she had become one of the people he was trying to protect, perhaps the most important one. Her presence here, this unspoken thing between them, had made him a bigger target, had given Calder a weapon to use against him. She reached out and put a hand on his arm. her touch surprisingly gentle. "You don't know what you're doing," she whispered, the words a plea. She wasn't questioning his plan or his courage. She was telling him he didn't see the true danger, that by caring for her, he was putting a bullseye on his own heart. Eli looked down at her hand on his arm, at the genuine fear for him in her moss-green eyes. In that moment, all the noise, all the doubt, all the self-recrimination fell away, replaced by a single, stark clarity. He had been a man alone for so long, defined by his failures and his past, but he wasn't alone anymore. This woman, this fierce, resilient, stubborn woman, had become the anchor of this new, fragile world he was fighting for. Her safety was not a liability. It was the entire point. She was not a reason to retreat. She was the reason to stand and fight. He moved his hand to cover hers, his calloused fingers wrapping around her own. He leaned in close, his face just inches from hers, his voice a low, fierce murmur that was for her and her alone. "I know you're mine," he said. It wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of allegiance. It meant, you belong here, with us. In this fight, we are part of the same whole. It was the truest thing he had ever said. And then he claimed her lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was as desperate and raw as the world around them. It tasted of dust and smoke and the salt of unshed tears. It was trembling and uncertain at first, then deepened into something fierce and affirming, a pact sealed in the darkness. It was a promise to share the consequences, to stand together in the ashes and face whatever came next. It was the lighting of a new fire, small and fragile. In the wreckage of the old, when they broke apart, they were both breathless. The air between them had changed. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of the stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been joined by something else, a shared resolve. They walked back to the chapel together, their hands brushing. Inside, the argument had reached a fever pitch. Eli stepped forward into the lamplight, and the room fell silent. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and clear, all trace of his earlier torment gone. "Agnes is right," he said. "We can't wait for help, but we can't fight him on his terms. We need to choose the ground. We need to set a trap he'll walk right into." He looked at Hector. "There's a place north of here, a few miles up the trail. Boxed Wash. It's a narrow canyon, sheer rock walls on both sides, with a floor of loose shale. It's a death trap if you don't know it's coming." A plan began to form, spoken in low, determined voices in the quiet of the little chapel. They would gather what was left of the herd. Agnes and Hector would go back to town and let the word slip in the saloon, where Calder's spies were sure to hear it. They would say that Hart, broken and defeated, was trying to sneak the last of his cattle through Boxed Wash at night. Hoping to avoid the main trail, they would make it sound like a coward's desperate move. They would be waiting for him. Jeb and the best of the other marksmen would be hidden on the canyon rims. The rest would be positioned to block the exit. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance. They left the chapel as the sky was beginning to pale with the false dawn. A vow had been made in that small, holy place, a promise that went beyond saving a herd of cattle or a single ranch. They would stand together. This time, no one would be left behind. The 2 days leading up to the confrontation were a study in controlled tension. The plan, forged in the quiet desperation of the chapel, was set in motion with a series of deliberate, quiet acts. Hector Ruiz and Agnes Pike rode into Sagebrush Ford, their faces grim, playing the part of defeated messengers. In the smoky confines of the Copper Queen Saloon, a place where loose talk was the primary currency, they let the story slip. Hector, nursing a whiskey, spoke in a low, angry rumble to the bartender, just loud enough to be overheard by a known associate of Calder's. He cursed Eli Hart's name, calling him a coward for running, for planning to sneak his last few head of cattle through the narrow confines of Boxed Wash in the dead of night. Agnes, in her general store, told a similar story to a customer, her voice laced with disappointment, lamenting that Hart had lost his nerve. The bait was laid, smelling of desperation and defeat. Back at the Sloan granary, Maeve O'Rourke became the quartermaster of their small rebellion. She was no longer just a cook. She was a field commander of logistics. Her injured shoulder was a dull, throbbing ache, but she ignored it. Her focus absolute. She organized the limited resources with ruthless efficiency. She tore clean flour sacks into strips for bandages and boiled water to keep them sterile. She filled every available canteen and water skin. To each of the fighters, she gave a small bundle, a handful of jerky, a piece of hard bread, and a warning to conserve their ammunition. She established a signal system, a series of sharp blasts on a small tin whistle, to communicate between the groups. Her corner of the granary looked less like a kitchen and more like a field dressing station, a grim testament to the fact that she was preparing not just for a fight, but for its inevitable, bloody consequences. Under the cover of darkness, they moved into position. The air in Boxed Wash was cold and still, the towering rock walls on either side blotting out most of the stars. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scuttling of unseen creatures and the soft crunch of boots on loose rock. Jeb Crow and Nell Carter, their faces darkened with soot, scaled the treacherous northern cliff face, finding positions that gave them a clear, crisscrossing field of fire down into the canyon. Jeb, with his calm precision, was the anchor. Nell, despite the raw wound on her leg, moved with a steady determination, her rifle a familiar weight in her hands. On the southern rim, Lou Tate, his earlier cynicism burned away by grief, directed the small group of farmers, helping them build a flimsy-looking but strategically placed barricade of deadfall and rock at the canyon's western mouth. It was designed not to stop a charge, but to funnel it, to create a fatal bottleneck. Eli moved between the positions, his voice a low whisper in the darkness, making sure every man and woman knew their role. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the cold, clear focus of a man who has accepted the terms of the fight. This was a battlefield of his own choosing, a landscape he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. His final stop was at the eastern entrance to the wash. There, in the deepest shadows, Maeve waited with a few of the older men, their task to guard the retreat and tend to the wounded. The night before, she had hauled bucket after bucket of water from the creek, soaking a wide patch of bentonite clay at the canyon's entrance until it was a slick, treacherous bog hidden under a thin layer of dust. It was a humble weapon, an ambush made of mud and patience. He found her checking the wrapping on a rifle. In the faint starlight, he could see the determined set of her jaw. They stood for a moment in silence, the unspoken weight of their last conversation, of their kiss in the darkness, hanging between them. There were 100 things he wanted to say, but none of the words felt right. Instead, he simply reached out and squeezed her good arm. "Be safe," he murmured. "You too," she whispered back, her voice fierce. "Don't you go getting yourself killed. Eli Hart, I'm not cleaning up that mess." It was her own way of saying she cared, a promise wrapped in thorns. They didn't have to wait long. Just before dawn, the lookout signaled. A large group of riders was approaching, moving fast. Calder had swallowed the bait whole. Eli scrambled up the northern cliff to join Jeb and Nell, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He peered over the edge. It was worse than he'd feared. Calder rode at the head of a column of nearly 20 men, and behind them, a smaller but still significant group of 6 riders, with the glint of a tin star at their lead. Sheriff Briggs had come to officially sanction the slaughter. 25 guns against their 12. The odds were impossible. Calder's men rode into the wash with a swaggering confidence, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. They were hunters closing in on cornered prey. They passed the slick patch of clay without noticing it, their eyes fixed on the far end of the canyon. Eli waited until the entire column was inside the wash, until they were directly below the hidden riflemen. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He raised his rifle, took aim not at a man, but at a large, precariously balanced rock above the trail, and fired. The shot was the signal. The rock tumbled down, crashing onto the canyon floor and sending horses skittering. At the same instant, Jeb and Nell opened fire from their positions, their shots echoing like a thunderclap in the narrow space. From the southern rim, Lou Tate and the farmers added their own volley. The canyon erupted into a chaotic symphony of ricocheting bullets, panicked shouts, and the terrified screaming of horses. Calder's confident hunting party was instantly transformed into a writhing, confused mass of men, trapped in a shooting gallery. "Pull back, retreat," Calder roared, his voice cutting through the din. He was no fool. He knew a trap when he saw one. He and his men wheeled their horses around, trying to flee back the way they came, but as they galloped toward the entrance, their horses hit the slick patch of clay Maeve had prepared. The animals' hooves slid out from under them, sending them crashing to the ground in a tangle of flailing limbs. The orderly retreat dissolved into a chaotic pileup. For a moment, it seemed their desperate plan had worked, but then Eli saw a movement on the far side of the canyon, on the rear slope behind Jeb and Nell's position. Sheriff Briggs, the coward, had been clever. He had split his men off, circling around to flank them. A new series of shots rang out, this time from behind and above them. Eli saw Nell cry out and clutch her side, her rifle clattering on the rocks as she slumped against the cliff face. A heartbeat later, one of Briggs's men, firing wildly, dislodged a section of loose shale above Jeb's position. With a low groan, a large slab of rock slid down, pinning Jeb's leg, trapping him in the open. Down below, Maeve saw it happen. She saw Jeb trapped, saw Nell go down. Without a second's hesitation, she broke from the cover of the canyon entrance, the tin whistle dropping from her hand, and scrambled up the scree slope toward Jeb, heedless of the bullets zipping past her. Eli's world narrowed to that single, desperate image, Maeve, her red hair a defiant banner in the smoky chaos. Running into the crossfire, "Maeve, no!" he yelled, but his voice was lost in the roar of the battle. She reached Jeb, straining to push the heavy rock that had him pinned. As she struggled, a bullet from Briggs's position tore through the loose fabric of her shirt, grazing her side. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled, her hand flying to the wound. A dark stain began to spread across the pale cotton of her shirt. The sight of that blood, of Maeve falling, flipped a switch deep inside Eli Hart. The cautious rancher, the guilt-ridden soldier, vanished. In his place was the cavalry scout who had survived a dozen desperate skirmishes, a man whose rage was not hot and reckless, but cold, clear, and brutally efficient. All fear, all doubt, was burned away, leaving only a single, stark purpose in this now. "Lou!" he bellowed, his voice a commander's roar that cut through the noise. "Lay down covering fire on that ridge, Jeb. You're hit." "Legs pinned, but I can still shoot," Jeb yelled back, already reloading his rifle from his trapped position. Eli ripped a canvas pouch from his belt. It was filled with the damp, heavy moss he'd gathered from the creek bank. "Cover your faces," he yelled. He lit a match, touched it to the tinder in the pouch, and hurled the smoldering bundle down into the center of the wash. It landed among Calder's men, billowing a thick, acrid, sight-obscuring smoke. He threw two more, creating a dense, roiling smokescreen that filled the canyon floor. "Hector, with me," he commanded. He didn't wait for a reply. He slid and scrambled down the cliff face, landing in a crouch in the swirling smoke. Through the haze, he could see the confused shapes of Calder's men, coughing and blinded. He moved through them like a ghost, his pistol in his hand, his eyes searching for only one man. He found Calder trying to rally his men near the pileup of fallen horses. Eli crashed into him, driving a shoulder into his chest and sending them both to the ground. Calder was strong, but Eli was fueled by a cold, focused fury. He slammed Calder's gun hand against a rock until the pistol fell from his grasp. Calder's men, their leader down and their vision obscured by smoke, began to break. Some threw down their guns, their hands in the air. Others scrambled away on foot. Sheriff Briggs and his remaining men, seeing the tide turn so violently, fired a last parting volley and fled. Eli hauled Calder to his feet, his fist connecting with Calder's jaw in a short, brutal punch. Calder staggered. Eli hit him again, a clean, sharp blow that sent the cattle baron crumbling to the ground, unconscious. The battle was over. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the ragged. Desperate sound of men coughing in the lingering smoke. Eli stood over Calder's still form, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. He had won. He turned his head, his eyes searching the cliffside, looking for Maeve. He saw her. She had managed to free Jeb's leg, and now she was slumping against the rock wall, her face ashen. As he watched, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slid slowly to the ground in a dead faint. The chaos of the battle bled away into a landscape of staggered, smoke-choked survivors. Eli's victory felt like a mouthful of ash. He scrambled up the cliffside, his boots slipping on the loose rock, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He reached Maeve just as Hector Ruiz, his face a mask of grim concern, was gently examining her wound. The bullet had torn a shallow but bloody furrow along her ribs. She was unconscious, her face unnervingly pale beneath its dusting of soot and grime. "We have to get her back to town," Eli said, his voice raw. Together, he and Hector fashioned a makeshift litter from 2 rifles and a blanket. The journey back to Sagebrush Ford was a blur of dust and dread for Eli. Every jolt, every stumble, sent a fresh wave of fear through him. They didn't take her to the Sloan granary, but straight to the chapel, the only place in town large enough and clean enough to serve as a proper infirmary. A woman named Lottie Ames met them at the door. She was the town's self-taught nurse and midwife, a woman whose hands were as steady as her gaze. She took one look at Maeve, and her brisk, no-nonsense demeanor took over. "Bring her in. Put her on the first pew there. You," she said, pointing a finger at Hector. "Boil every drop of water you can find. And you," her eyes locked on Eli, "get out of my way unless you plan on holding her steady." What followed was the longest hour of Eli's life. Lottie Ames worked with a focused, methodical calm that was both terrifying and reassuring. With a pair of tweezers she'd held over a lamp flame, she probed the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. Eli stood at Maeve's head, his hand gripping hers, feeling the unnerving limpness in her fingers. He held a lantern, trying to keep the light steady as Lottie worked. He could see the intricate dance of muscle and sinew, the dark welling of blood. It was a violation, an intimate landscape of pain he felt he had no right to witness, yet he couldn't look away. He was the cause of this, his fight, his war. "There," Lottie said, a grunt of satisfaction in her voice. She held up the tweezers. A small, flattened piece of lead pinched in their grasp, passed right through the muscle, broke a rib, I think, but it missed the vitals. She's lucky. She then threaded a needle with gut and, with the same steady precision, began to stitch the wound closed. Eli watched, his throat tight, his own hands trembling slightly. He felt utterly useless. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his fists or a gun or a plan. But here, faced with the fragile reality of Maeve's life hanging in the balance, he had nothing. He could only stand and watch and hope. As Lottie tied off the final stitch and began to bandage the wound, Eli found himself bowing his head. He didn't know the proper words, the eloquent phrases of a church-going man. His prayer was a silent, desperate, ragged thing, a raw plea sent up into the dusty, lamp-lit rafters of the chapel. "Please, not her. Take anything else. Not her." While Maeve fought her own quiet battle in the chapel, The town of Sagebrush Ford was fighting another. The survivors from Boxed Wash had brought back not just their wounded, but a captive Vance Calder and the truth of Sheriff Briggs's betrayal. The simmering resentment that had been held in check for years by fear finally boiled over. Agnes Pike called a town meeting in the street, right in front of the saloon. It wasn't a formal affair with a gavel and minutes. It was a raw, angry gathering of citizens who had been pushed too far. Miners with calloused hands, farmers with sun-scorched faces, even some of the girls from the Copper Queen, their faces pale and determined in the harsh daylight. "Briggs is no sheriff of ours," one of the farmers shouted, and a roar of agreement went up from the crowd. "He's Calder's dog." Agnes Pike held up a hand for silence. "Then we'll make it official," she declared, her voice carrying over the angry murmur. "We, the people of this town, remove Doyle Briggs from his office for dereliction of duty and for conspiring against the very citizens he swore to protect. A unanimous, thundering aye was the response. A temporary council was formed on the spot. Agnes, Hector Ruiz, and Maribel Sloan. Their first act was to take pen to paper, drafting a long, detailed report of the events, to be sent by the next stage to the UTRS, Marshal in Cheyenne. Then came the testimonies. One by one, people who had lived in fear of Calder found their voices. A young woman from the saloon, her voice shaking but clear, told of how Calder's men had taken a cut of her earnings each week under the threat of violence. A wiry, dust-covered prospector spoke of how Calder had jumped his claim, using forged documents and Briggs's authority to drive him off the land. The stories poured out, a litany of petty cruelties and grand thefts that had bled the community dry. With every story, the power that Calder had held over them for so long seemed to shrink, to wither under the bright, unforgiving light of public truth. They were no longer isolated victims. They were a community, united by a shared wound and a shared resolve to heal it. Eli stayed by Maeve's side. He watched her breathe. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest under the clean white bandages. He learned the rhythm of it, the quietest, most important sound in the world. In those long, silent hours, something inside him began to shift. The guilt was still there, a dull ache in his bones, but it was no longer the all-consuming shadow it had once been. He looked at his own scraped and bloody knuckles and thought of the fury that had driven him in the canyon. He had fought, he had protected, he had refused to stand by while the people he cared for were harmed. He realized, with a startling clarity, that his greatest sin as a soldier had not been his refusal to fire on an innocent village, but his belief that his failure to do more had rendered him powerless forever. He had been so consumed by the one battle he couldn't win that he had forgotten how to fight the ones he could. Standing up, at the right time, for the right reason, that was a kind of honor, too. Maeve woke on the second day. Her first sensation was a deep, searing pain in her side, and her first sight was Eli's face, haggard with exhaustion, his head resting on his arms on the edge of the pew. She was in the chapel. The memory of the battle, of Jeb's leg, of the sting of the bullet, came rushing back. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His head jerked up, his eyes instantly alert. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over his face. "Maeve, you're awake." He helped her take a sip of water from a tin cup, his hand gentle on the back of her head. They talked for a long time, in low voices, as the afternoon sun streamed through the chapel's tall windows. He told her what had happened in the town, how the people had stood up, how Calder was being held in the blacksmith's forge under a citizen's guard. She listened, a thoughtful expression on her face. The woman who had arrived in the territory with the sole intention of protecting herself, of keeping the world at arm's length, had become the catalyst for a community's salvation. "When I get back on my feet," she said, her gaze moving around the chapel, at the faces of the townspeople who came and went in quiet support. "I'm going to build a proper kitchen at your place, stone foundation, a real stove, a place big enough to feed a crew. Or the whole town if a blizzard hits or the crops fail. She looked at him, her moss-green eyes clear and serious. I think I'll stay. For a while. She was no longer just a survivor, fending for herself. She had become the keeper of the fire, the one who fed the community. She had found a home, not in a building, but in a purpose. Later that day, Lou Tate walked out to the small, wind-swept hill where Tommy Birch was buried. He stood before the simple wooden cross for a long time, his hat in his hands. He was a man hollowed out by grief and shame. He had been the one who scoffed, who sneered at the presence of women, who had treated Maeve with such disdain. And in the end, it had been Maeve who had run into the fire to save one of his own. He eventually made his way to the chapel, his boots quiet on the dusty floorboards. He found Maeve propped up on some pillows, looking pale but alert. He stopped at the end of the pew, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Ma'am?" he began, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I was wrong. About everything. About you. Tommy, he looked up to all of us. And I filled his head with foolishness." He finally looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'd be honored, ma'am, if you'd be willing. I'd like to learn how to cook. The trail coffee, the sourdough, whatever you're willing to teach. Someone's got to keep the boys fed. Someone's got to keep us together." Maeve looked at the broken man before her, and she saw not an antagonist, but another survivor. "All right, Lou," she said softly. "When I'm able, the first lesson is you never ever skimp on the coffee." As evening fell, a soft breeze blew through the town, clearing away the last of the dust from the battle. From the chapel doorway, Eli looked out at the tall cottonwood tree in the town square. A week ago, it had been battered by the hailstorm, its leaves shredded. Now, in the gentle light of the setting sun, he could see that its branches were covered in a fine, white fluff of new cotton. It looked like the tree was covered in a soft, late-season snow, a quiet, simple promise of renewal blooming in the wake of the storm. The wheels of official justice, when they finally arrived in Sagebrush Ford, turned slowly and with a weary groan. A week after the battle at Boxed Wash, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. He was a U.S. Marshal out of Cheyenne, a man named Elias Thorne, whose face was as weathered and creased as an old map. He had received the town council's hastily written report and had ridden hard, expecting to find a bloodbath and a lynch mob. Instead, he found a town quietly and efficiently governing itself, and a prisoner, Vance Calder, being held securely in the town's forge, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, simmering silence. Marshal Thorne was a man who understood the vast, empty spaces between the law and the reality of frontier life. He listened patiently in the chapel as Agnes Pike, Hector Ruiz, and Eli Hart laid out the entire story, from the first threat to the final, desperate ambush. He examined the wounded, took depositions from the miners and the saloon girls, and walked the length of Boxed Wash, his keen eyes reading the story of the battle in the spent cartridges and the scarred rocks. He took Calder into his custody, clapping the man in federal irons with a grim finality. There was no grand speech, no celebration in the town. Calder's removal was a quiet, necessary act, like lancing a wound to let the poison out. Several of Calder's captured men, facing the prospect of a rope, were quick to trade their testimony for a lesser charge. Their signed statements painted a damning picture of Sheriff Doyle Briggs, who was now a fugitive with a federal warrant on his head, a man destined to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. In the days that followed, Eli, Jeb, and Lou Tate rode the range, gathering the scattered remnants of the herd. They found them in small, frightened bunches, driven miles by the stampede but still alive. When the final count was made, they had managed to recover 12 of the original 18 head. It wasn't a fortune, but combined with the bounty the marshal had authorized for the capture of Calder, It was enough. It was enough to pay his debts to Agnes. It was enough to buy supplies for the coming winter. It was enough to save Heart's Draw. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwood leaves along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold and yellow. The harsh, scouring wind of summer softened into a crisp, cool breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and curing hay. The raw wound of their losses began to scar over, healing into a new kind of strength. A new foundation was being laid at Heart's Draw, and it was made of stone. Maeve's kitchen was rising from the earth, built on the spot where the old chuck wagon had burned. Hector Ruiz, in his spare hours, had become a master stonemason, laying a foundation that looked as if it could withstand a siege. The walls were framed with sturdy timber, and the new tin roof gleamed in the autumn sun. It was becoming the solid, permanent heart of the ranch, a testament to a future none of them had dared to imagine just a few months before. Inside, amid the organized chaos of construction, Maeve had already established her domain. A large cast-iron stove, bought with part of the bounty money, stood proudly in the center of the room. The air was constantly filled with the warm, yeasty aroma of her sourdough starter, which she tended with the devotion of a priestess. Lou Tate had become her unlikely but dedicated apprentice. He had a surprisingly gentle touch with dough and a solemn focus as he learned the alchemy of turning flour and water into the bread that had become the staple of their new life. One cool afternoon, Eli walked into the half-finished kitchen. He had been mending fences, and his hands were scratched and sore. Maeve was at a large wooden table, kneading a massive ball of dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. The painful-looking scar on her side was a permanent reminder of the price they had paid, but she moved with her old energy, her movements strong and sure. A fine dusting of flour covered her apron and her forearms. Eli came and stood beside her, watching the rhythmic push and pull of her hands. He picked up a handful of flour from the sack, letting the fine powder run through his fingers. He had come to think of this kitchen as the truest place in the world, a place of warmth and creation, of simple, life-giving work. He thought of all the years he had spent alone in his ramshackle cabin, the silence broken only by the wind. It was a life he could no longer imagine returning to. "We'll have the windows in by next week," he said, his voice quiet. "And Hector says the door should be ready to hang by then." "Good," Maeve said without looking up from her work. "A kitchen isn't a kitchen without a proper door to keep the drafts out." He hesitated for a moment, the unspoken words feeling heavy and clumsy on his tongue. He had faced down gunslingers and corrupt lawmen, but this felt infinitely more terrifying. He reached out, his hand dusted with flour, and gently touched her arm, stopping her work. She looked up, her moss-green eyes questioning. "I was hoping," he began, his voice a little rough, "that you'd consider this your place, not just for the winter, for as long as you want it." He looked around the unfinished room, at the solid stone foundation, the sturdy walls. "I don't just want to build a ranch. Maeve, I want to build a home, a place with an open door, for people who've lost their way, a place with a warm fire and a hot meal waiting. I can't do that alone." He finally met her gaze, his heart in his eyes. "I don't want to do it alone." He wasn't offering her a cage, no matter how gilded. He wasn't asking her to be his wife in the traditional sense of the word. He was asking her to be his partner, to build a future with him. Side by side, he was offering her a home that she herself would help create, on her own terms. A slow smile spread across Maeve's face, a genuine, unguarded smile that made the freckles on her nose dance. She looked from his earnest, hopeful face to his hand, still resting on her arm, leaving a faint white print on her sleeve. "All right, Eli Hart," she said softly. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, warm kiss that tasted of flour and hope. When she pulled back, a mischievous glint had returned to her eyes. "I'll stay, but I'm keeping the knife." She patted the familiar bone-handled blade at her belt. "It's the West, after all." And so, Hart's Draw changed. It became more than just a name on a map. It became a destination, a sanctuary. Word spread along the cattle trails and through the mining camps of a place where a traveler could find a hot meal, a safe bed, and a fair hearing. No questions asked. The rules of the ranch were simple and enforced not by one man, but by the collective will of the community that had forged it in fire and blood. On the hill overlooking the creek, the simple wooden cross that marked Tommy Birch's grave was now enclosed by a neat, sturdy fence of whitewashed wood. Someone, no one ever said who, always kept the small plot clear of weeds and often left a small bundle of wildflowers by the marker. And all along the trail leading to Sagebrush Ford, the old, faded wooden mileposts, their markings once scoured into illegibility by the wind and the dust, had been given a fresh coat of paint. They stood out now, bright and clear against the landscape, a simple, decent gesture to help new travelers find their way, so that no one else would get lost in the unforgiving wilderness. The dawn that now broke over Hart's Draw was quiet and warm, and full of the promise of a day's hard, honest work. It was a peace that was not given, but earned. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.